Please subscribe to my channel. This is my sincere request to you." They looked at my scuffed boots before my face. My brother laughed as my silver sedan idled outside the bellwether house. My mother asked about my highway motel, and my sister-in-law whispered, "People like me belong nowhere near crystal chandeliers." They assumed I came begging for a seat. They had no idea I was there to decide who loses the table, the money, and the narrative. Tonight, the manager would take the microphone and silence the room. "My name is Kylie Johnson. I am 33 years old." And as I steered my decade-old silver sedan up the sweeping, heated driveway of the Bellwether House Hotel on Christmas Eve, I knew I was driving into a battlefield disguised as a winter wonderland. The wind off the lake was brutal, rattling the loose windows of my car. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the temperature of the welcome I was about to receive. The Bellwether was not just a hotel. It was a monument to excess, an architectural marvel of carved limestone, polished brass, and intimidating prestige. It was the kind of place where fortunes were quietly traded over glasses of scotch that cost hundreds of dollars a pour. As I pulled up to the grand entrance, my rattling engine broke the hushed, expensive silence of the driveway. A fleet of valets in forest green uniforms and tailored winter coats stood at attention. They were accustomed to opening doors for gleaming black Bentleys and silver Mercedes, vehicles that hummed with quiet, insulated wealth. When my battered sedan finally rolled to a stop, the head valet visibly hesitated. He was a young man, but his eyes held the sharp judgment of the elite class he served. His white-gloved hand hovered awkwardly in the freezing air. He glanced over my roof toward the busy avenue, perhaps hoping I was merely a confused delivery driver looking for a place to turn around. I put the gear shift into park, killed the struggling engine, and stepped out into the biting chill. I handed him the keys without a word. I pulled my dark wool coat tighter around my shoulders. It was a heavy, practical garment I had worn through 6 bitter winters. The edges of the cuffs were fraying, and the deep navy color had long since faded into a tired, dusty blue after years of cheap, dry cleaning. I carried a small leather handbag, its strap worn soft from use. It held my phone, my wallet, and exactly what I needed for tonight. Nothing more. As I approached the heavy brass-framed glass doors, a doorman in a top hat pulled them open. He did not offer the worn deferential greeting he had just given the couple in mink coats ahead of me. He simply stepped back, his posture stiff. The lobby hit me with a solid wall of warm air, heavily scented with roasted cinnamon, fresh cedar, and raw, unapologetic entitlement. Overhead, 3 massive crystal chandeliers threw fractured, dazzling light across the imported Italian marble floors. A towering Christmas tree decorated entirely in silver and white glass ornaments dominated the center of the room. A string quartet played softly in a corner alcove. It was a space meticulously designed to make anyone without a heady bank account feel incredibly small and entirely out of place. The receptionist at the long mahogany front desk proved this rule immediately. As I paused near the check-in area to get my bearings, her eyes swept over me. I watched her professional gaze drop to my scuffed black winter boots, travel slowly up the dull fabric of my old coat, and finally land on my wind-blown hair. Her practiced, welcoming smile thinned instantly into a flat line of polite dismissal. She looked away, pretending to type on her keyboard, silently signaling that I was not worth her attention. I did not care about the receptionist. My attention was fixed on the group waiting near the grand sweeping staircase. My family, they were watching my arrival, and they were not looking at me with the warmth of a holiday reunion. They watched me with the specific, hungry anticipation of bored people who have just found their evening entertainment. My older brother, Brent Johnson, stood at the absolute center of their circle. At 37, he was the current head of Johnson Vale Development, and he dressed the part with aggressive precision. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie that probably cost more than my car insurance. He exuded the loud, fragile confidence of a man desperate to prove he belonged among the elite. When he saw me walking across the marble floor, his lips curled into a broad, mocking smirk that he made no effort to conceal. "Did your navigation app pull up the wrong address?" Kylie Brent asked, his voice booming effortlessly over the soft holiday jazz. He wanted people to hear him. There is a discount motel about 15 miles down the interstate. This is the Bellwether. Are you sure you are in the right zip code?" My mother, Lorraine, stepped forward. She was wrapped in an ivory cashmere shawl, heavy diamond drops pulling at her earlobes. She smelled of overpowering floral perfume and the sharp tang of expensive gin. She reached out to adjust my collar, a deeply maternal gesture that was entirely poisoned by the vicious sweetness of her tone. "Now, Brent, you must not tease your sister," Lorraine scolded softly, though her eyes danced with cruel amusement. "I think it is very brave of her to show up here tonight. Even if a single night in one of these standard rooms costs far more than a whole month of her little clerical salary, we should applaud her courage." I let her cold, manicured fingers graze my neck. I kept my face perfectly still, a mask of dull acceptance. "I am just here for the family dinner. Mother, I do not need a room." Tesser, my sister-in-law, let out a sharp, chiming laugh that sounded like breaking glass. She was draped in a clinging emerald silk dress, clutching a half-empty crystal champagne flute. She leaned against Brent, her eyes raking over my outfit. "Well, I certainly hope you remembered to bring cash for the valet tip, sweetie. It is $1.40 just to park a car here, and you know they do not accept discount coupons." I did not defend my finances. I did not explain that I had plenty of cash or that my role at Gray Haven's Special Assets Group was light years away from simple clerical work. I offered them the exact reaction they craved, passive silence. I let them have their familiar script. They needed me to be the ragged, failing younger sister so they could feel like the conquering victors of the Johnson family legacy. Brent turned his attention away from me, sweeping his arm dramatically toward the arched gilded hallway that led to the private event spaces. He was playing to the room now. "Tonight is about celebrating the new Meridian Spire property deal. I rented the grand ballroom. 250 guests are arriving soon. The biggest investors, contractors, and politicians in the city. I needed everyone to see exactly what Johnson Vale Development is capable of achieving. This hotel, this absolute level of prestige, it is the new standard for us. We are playing in the major leagues now." He kept talking, his voice dripping with self-importance, but I tuned his words out. While he bragged to Tesser and Lorraine, my eyes moved past his broad shoulders, performing a rapid, quiet audit of the grand lobby. I was not blinded by the luxury. I was reading the machinery underneath it. I noted the positioning of the discreet security guards standing near the emergency exits. I counted the wait staff moving seamlessly between the kitchen corridors and the ballroom entrance. I memorized the layout of the concierge desk and the flow of the guest traffic. Then I found exactly who I was looking for. Standing near the heavy velvet curtains of the restaurant wing was Adrian Vale, the general manager of the Bellwether House. He stood impeccably straight in a sharp black tuxedo, his hands clasped behind his back, his intelligent eyes surveying the lobby with absolute authority. For a brief second, our gazes locked over the heads of the milling wealthy patrons to anyone else in the room. His expression remained perfectly blank, the picture of professional detachment. But for a fraction of a heartbeat, his chin dipped down, a single, barely perceptible nod. It was a silent acknowledgement of a private ironclad arrangement, a confirmation that everything was in place. I looked away instantly, fixing my gaze on a massive silver ornament hanging from the lower branches of the lobby tree. I made absolutely certain that my brother, my mother, and my sister-in-law court nothing of that silent exchange. And just then the heavy glass doors opened again, bringing in a gust of freezing wind and a loud group of Brent's business associates. They were older men in thick cashmere overcoats, radiating wealth and loud confidence. Brent immediately puffed out his chest, stepping away from us to greet them with booming, back-slapping enthusiasm. One of the men, a lead investor I recognized from my company files, glanced over at me. He took in my warm winter coat, my scuffed boots, and my silent demeanor. He raised a questioning eyebrow at my brother, clearly wondering why someone who looked like a lost pedestrian was standing with the host of the evening. Brent did not even bother to lower his voice. "Oh, you can ignore her," he said smoothly, making absolutely sure the words carried across the marble floor for everyone to hear. "That is just my little sister. She is a bit too poor for a place like this, but it is Christmas, so we decided to let her tag along for a free meal." The businessman chuckled politely. Lorraine sighed a long, dramatic sigh of a burdened mother. Tessa smirked behind the rim of her crystal glass, taking another slow sip of champagne. I stood in the center of the glittering, opulent lobby, feeling the heavy weight of their collective contempt pressing down on my shoulders. I did not flush with embarrassment. I did not snap back with a defensive remark. I simply tightened my grip on the worn leather strap of my handbag and started walking slowly toward the hallway leading to the grand ballroom. I walked in total, unbroken silence, moving with the steady, measured pace of a woman who had spent years waiting for this exact ruinous night to finally begin. The transition from the grand lobby to the private reception lounge felt like crossing an invisible border. The air in the private wing was thick with the scent of expensive orchids and old money. My family swept into the room, instantly commanding the attention of the staff and the few early arrivals. I trailed slightly behind, a shadow in my faded wool coat, watching the performance begin. My mother, Lorraine, immediately spotted a couple she knew from her country club days. They were an older pair, dripping in subtle designer labels and the kind of relaxed posture that only comes from generational wealth. Lorraine glided toward them, her arms outstretched, offering air kisses that never quite touched their cheeks. After she spent several minutes boasting about Brent and his spectacular new residential tower project, the older woman turned her polite, searching gaze toward me. "And this must be your daughter," the woman said, her tone carrying a mild, detached curiosity. "I do not believe we have formerly met. What is it that you do, my dear?" Before I could even open my mouth to introduce myself or my firm, my mother cut in. Her voice was as smooth and sweet as warm honey, perfectly designed to mask the poison underneath. "Oh, Kylie works in debt collection paperwork," Lorraine said, waving her hand dismissively as if swatting away a mildly annoying fly. "She sits in a little cubicle downtown, shuffling through foreclosure notices and organizing files for people who cannot pay their bills. It is a very tedious sort of clerical job, but it pays her rent, and we are just so proud she manages to keep a steady schedule." The older couple exchanged a fleeting, uncomfortable glance. In their world, dealing with debt was a vulgarity. Managing investments was respectable. Collecting bad loans was the work of the desperate or the failed. The woman offered me a thin, tight-lipped smile of pure pity. Brent materialized beside us, holding a fresh tumbler of amber liquid. He clink-kicked the ice cubes loudly, making sure the small crowd was paying attention to him. He never missed an opportunity to elevate himself by standing on my shoulders. "Now, mother, do not sell her short." Brent chuckled, though his eyes were completely devoid of warmth. "Kylie has a fantastic head for basic bookkeeping. She is great at looking backward and tallying up the past, but she just lacks the vision for real business. You need a certain kind of aggressive instinct to build the future, to put together a $90 million development deal from scratch. Kylie prefers the safety of the back office where there is no real risk, and that is perfectly fine. We cannot all be industry leaders." The guests murmured their polite agreements, nodding at my brother with deep respect. To them I was entirely transparent. I was the cautionary tale of the family, the unremarkable sibling invited out of sheer holiday obligation. I felt the collective weight of their upper-class judgment settling over me. It was the exact type of social pressure designed to make a person shrink, to make them apologize for taking up space in such a magnificent room. Tessa, sensing the shifted dynamic, stepped close to my side. She leaned in, her cloying perfume momentarily overpowering the scent of the orchids. She placed a manicured hand on my forearm, pressing her acrylic nails slightly into my sleeve in a gesture that mimicked affection, but felt like a warning. "Listen, honey," Tessa whispered loudly enough for the nearest investors to overhear. "I know this whole scene can be a little overwhelming for you. All these important people, the heavy business talk, the sheer scale of what Brent is doing tonight. If you feel out of place, no one is going to judge you. You can just grab a plate from the buffet, find a quiet corner, and head back home early before the real investor crowd arrives." We will completely understand if you need to escape back to your comfort zone." I looked at Tesser. Her eyes were bright with malice. She wanted me to leave, but she also wanted the satisfaction of watching me run away. I did not give her either. "I will stay right here, Tesser," I replied, my voice perfectly level, stripping away any emotion she could feed on. "I am actually very interested in seeing exactly who Brent has invited tonight." I watched the muscle in Brent's jaw twitch just a fraction of a millimeter, but it was there. My brother was putting on a masterful show of dominance, but underneath the tailored suit and the expensive scotch, there was a frantic energy radiating from him. He was talking a little too loudly, laughing a little too hard. As I stood silently at the edge of their circle, absorbing their thinly veiled insults, the reality of the evening began to snap into sharp focus. This was not a family reunion. Brent was using this extravagant Christmas Eve dinner as a theatrical stage to consolidate his fragile position with his business partners. He needed to project an image of absolute, unshakable success. And I was not just an unwanted guest. I was a prop. I was the designated failure he kept around to highlight his own brilliance. But there was something else, a subtle undercurrent of desperation beneath the arrogance. Over the past 20 minutes, I had caught snippets of Brent's hushed conversations with his legal advisor near the coat check. Words like extension, grace period, and collateral had floated through the air. They thought I was too slow to understand, too disconnected to care. They did not realize that I spent my days dissecting the financial ruin of men exactly like my brother. My family needed something from me tonight. They had not invited me simply to mock my boots or my job. There was a specific calculated reason I was standing in the bellwether house, but they were stretching out the psychological warfare, waiting for the perfect moment to spring the trap. The hostility in the room felt incredibly familiar. It dragged me back 4 years to the bitter afternoon in the executive boardroom of Johnson Vale Development. Back then, I was the one running the operational logistics for the massive riverfront commercial park. I had caught the lead contractor substituting gradier steel with cheaper non-compliant materials. When I brought the evidence to Brent, he did not fire the contractor. He fired me. He manipulated the board, blamed me for the 5-month delay that followed, and painted my strict adherence to the rules as hysterical micromanagement. He had stolen my reputation to cover his own corrupt compromises. I felt a cold tightness in my chest at the memory, a brief flash of the old anger. Lorraine must have noticed the slight shift in my posture, the hardening of my expression. She stepped away from her wealthy friends and cornered me near a towering floral arrangement. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Kylie," Lorraine hissed, dropping the sweet motherly act entirely. Her face was tight with irritation. "Do not do that. Do not put on that sour face. You are always so incredibly sensitive. Brant was only making a harmless joke about your job, and you act as if he stabbed you in the back. You hold on to these ridiculous grudges, and it completely ruins the holiday spirit for the rest of us. For once in your life, can you please just try to be supportive of your brother instead of being so emotionally fragile?" It was her favorite tactic. Whenever they crossed a line, whenever they acted with blatant cruelty, Lorraine would immediately twist the narrative. She weaponized my natural reactions, turning their moral failures into my emotional defects. If I defended myself, I was being difficult. If I stayed silent, I was being sullen. It was a game designed so that I could never win. "I am perfectly fine, Mother," I said, looking her directly in the eye. "I am just taking in the atmosphere. It is a very revealing night." Lorraine frowned, clearly unnerved by my calm demeanor. She opened her mouth to snap another reprimand, but Brent suddenly clapped his hands together, signaling the group to move toward the grand dining hall. As the crowd began to shuffle down the wide corridor, Brent dropped back to walk beside me. The loud booming persona vanished. He lowered his voice, adopting a casual, almost brotherly tone that immediately set off every alarm bell in my head. "Hey, Kai," he muttered, using a childhood nickname he had not spoken in years. "Listen, I am glad you made it tonight. Truly. And hey, after we finished dinner and the speeches, there is a tiny favor I need from you. My lawyers found an old piece of paperwork from Dad's estate during an end-of-year audit. It is just some outdated compliance form regarding that empty lot out by Cedar Hollow. It needs your signature just to tidy up the family files and close out the fiscal year. We can knock it out in 2 minutes over dessert." He smiled down at me, a perfect picture of casual innocence. I looked at his expensive tie, the sweat gathering at his hairline, and the desperate, hungry look in his eyes. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess against a blind opponent. "Of course, Brent," I replied softly, letting my voice sound compliant and naive. "We can look at the paperwork after dinner." He exhaled a quiet breath of relief and jogged ahead to rejoin his investors. I stayed behind, my heart beating with a steady, dangerous rhythm. I knew exactly what was happening now. Tonight was not just a meal, it was an ambush. And they had absolutely no idea that I was the one holding the loaded gun. The corridor leading away from the private reception area and toward the main event spaces was a masterclass in psychological architecture. The ceiling lowered slightly, the lighting shifted from the bright, glaring crystal of the lobby to a warm, intimate amber, and the thick hand-woven carpets absorbed the sound of footsteps. It made every conversation feel like a closely guarded corporate secret. My family swept ahead of me, drawn toward the booming holiday music and the clinking of glasses echoing from the massive double doors at the far end of the hall. Brent was leading the charge, surrounded by his sycophants, eager to inspect the ice sculptures and the floral arrangements he had supposedly purchased. I stopped walking. I let the distance between us stretch until their loud voices became a muted hum, and they finally disappeared around a gentle curve in the corridor. Once I was entirely alone, I pivoted smoothly and walked back toward the main lobby, slipping through a discreet, dimly lit archway that led to the private concierge services. The concierge desk was crafted from a single massive slab of dark walnut. Behind it stood Bryon Vale. He was not checking a computer monitor or greeting the passing guests with the usual practiced enthusiasm. He was standing perfectly still, his hands resting lightly on the polished wood, waiting exactly where I knew he would be. As I approached his station, I immediately adopted the physical posture of a confused, slightly overwhelmed relative asking for basic directions. I let my shoulders slump a fraction of an inch. I kept my eyes wide and uncertain. To any casual observer, including the 2 junior receptionists chatting quietly near the bank of elevators, I was just a lost guest asking what time the first course of the dinner would be served. But Adrian did not offer me a glossy hotel brochure or a condescending, placating smile. As I stepped up to the counter, he straightened his posture, his expression tightening into a mask of absolute guarded respect. "Good evening, MS. Johnson," Adrian said softly. His voice barely carried over the low, ambient hum of the lobby. The honorific was not the standard, mechanical greeting he gave to the wealthy patrons who tipped him with $100 bills. It was the distinct tone of a man addressing an equal in a very dangerous high-stakes game. "Everything is precisely as we discussed," Adrian continued, sliding his right hand smoothly beneath the elevated ledge of the wooden counter. He withdrew a flat, unmarked manila envelope. It was no thicker than a few sheets of paper, but to me it carried the immense destructive weight of a loaded weapon. He placed the envelope on the counter and slid it forward. His fingers lingered on the edge for a fraction of a second, ensuring no one else was watching us. "The hotel legal team has finalized the administrative hold. The internal operational files are locked and secured. Our general counsel is currently standing by in his private office on the mezzanine level. He will not initiate the breach protocol until you give the direct verbal signal." I nodded once, slipping the thin envelope swiftly into my worn leather handbag. "Thank you, Adrian. How long until the final banking deadline expires?" "The grace period for the wire transfer ended exactly 2 hours ago," he replied smoothly, his tone devoid of any emotion. His dark eyes flicked briefly toward the hallway where my brother had just vanished. "The account is officially delinquent." I walked away from the desk, moving toward a quiet, shadowed alcove near a towering marble pillar, far from the prying eyes of the front desk staff and the security cameras. I unclasped my bag and slid my hand inside, breaking the adhesive seal of the envelope with my thumb. I pulled out a single sheet of heavy stock paper. It was a printed bank statement directly from the hotel accounting department, stamped across the top with a bright red, undeniable warning label. It was the financial confirmation for the deposit on the Grand Ballroom. The required amount was a staggering $75,000. But beneath the bold numbers, the transaction status read: the electronic wire transfer had bounced due to critical insufficient funds. This was the first invisible thread unraveling my brother's carefully constructed empire. Brant was currently parading around the venue, shaking hands with influential politicians and taking credit for a spectacular Christmas Eve gala, but he had not actually paid for a single piece of it. He was operating on an illusion, floating on the arrogant assumption that the Bellwether House would simply bill him later because of his supposedly untouchable status in the city. He had no idea that the Bellwether House was no longer a compliant, eager partner. They were a hostile, deeply frustrated creditor. In my daily work at Greyhaven's Special Assets Group, I saw this exact pattern play out countless times. Desperate failing men always made the same predictable mistakes. When the corporate cash flow dried up, they stopped paying the invisible people first. They ignored the invoices from the concrete suppliers, the electrical contractors, and the independent landscaping crews. But eventually, the desperation always climbed the ladder. Brent had reached the catastrophic point where he was bouncing checks to premier luxury establishments. Johnson Vale Development was not just bleeding capital. It was actively bleeding out on the polished marble floors of the city's most expensive hotel. Furthermore, I knew from my secure files that the Bellwether House was already owed nearly $400,000 in unpaid corporate accounts from Brent's previous executive retreats and catering events over the last 2 years. This bounce deposit was the final unforgivable insult. A lesser person, someone driven by raw emotion, might have marched into the ballroom right then. They would have waved the rejected bank statement in the air and screamed about the fraud. I could have easily humiliated him in front of the caterers and the early arrivals, but that would have been a chaotic, messy outburst. It would have allowed Brent to spin a fast lie about a clerical error, a delayed bank routing number, or a frozen asset account. It would have given him an immediate escape route to save face. I did not want an emotional outburst. I wanted a total, unavoidable structural collapse. I needed Brent to stand on that stage. I needed him to give his arrogant, boastful speeches. I needed him to look every single investor, politician, and contractor in the eye and claim absolute financial supremacy. The higher he climbed his ladder of lies tonight, the harder the physical impact would be when I finally kicked the entire structure out from under him. I needed the maximum number of witnesses. I reached deep into the pocket of my coat and pulled out my phone. The screen cast a pale, cold glow across my knuckles. I opened my encrypted messaging application and found the active thread with Mara. She was my personal legal counsel and the lead restructuring attorney at Greyhaven. She was the only other person on the planet who saw the entire board, who understood the absolute depth of the rot hiding inside my brother's company. Her message from 20 minutes ago sat unread on my screen. She had asked if the target was securely in position and if she should initiate the preliminary asset freeze. I typed 2 simple words: not yet. I hit send and watched the delivery confirmation checkmark appear instantly. I was not acting out of malice or sudden impulsive anger. This was a surgical, calculated operation, meticulously planned over months of agonizing late nights tracing fraudulent accounts, hidden offshore transfers, and buried liabilities. I slid the phone back into my pocket, the cold metal grounding me to the reality of the moment. I took a slow, deep breath, inhaling the sharp scent of winter pine and expensive floor wax. I smoothed the frayed lapels of my tired wool coat. I forced the sharp, analytical part of my brain to retreat behind a solid wall of mild, unassuming compliance. I practiced my most submissive, weary expression in the reflection of a dark window. I had to look exactly like the defeated, powerless woman they all expected me to be. When I finally walked into the foyer of the Grand Ballroom, the noise hit me like a physical force. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes, the roar of confident, wealthy laughter, the swelling notes of a live brass band playing the beat holiday classics. My mother was holding court near a towering ice sculpture of a swan, and Tesser was aggressively flirting with a junior city councilman near the open bar. Brent spotted me lingering near the grand entrance. He rolled his eyes playfully at his group of prime investors, gesturing toward me with his glass as if to say, "Look at her." She finally found her way out of the hallway. I walked toward them, keeping my head slightly bowed, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. I looked at the intricate gold leaf painted on the high ceiling. I looked at the imported caviar circulating on heavy silver platters. I looked at my brother's smug, victorious face. They all believed I was just a naive, impoverished relative trying to survive a deeply humiliating evening. They thought I was swallowing my pride just to keep the family peace. They had absolutely no idea I was simply waiting for the music to stop before the first course of the dinner could be announced. Brent materialized at my side, his large hand clamped down on my shoulder, his grip significantly tighter than a casual brotherly squeeze should ever be. He steered me away from the lavish buffet lines in the brass band, guiding me forcefully through a heavy mahogany door located discreetly near the coat check area. We stepped out of the noisy celebration and into a small, suffocatingly quiet private parlor. The room smelled intensely of stale cigar smoke, expensive floor wax, and old leather. Sitting at a small round table in the center of the room was Wade Perring. WDE was the chief legal counsel for my brother's development firm, a man whose meticulously styled hair and custom-tailored suits could never quite hide the predatory, calculating gleam in his pale eyes. As soon as I crossed the threshold, WDE stood up immediately, flashing a brilliantly manufactured smile that did absolutely nothing to warm his cold expression. On the table between them sat a thick manila folder perfectly aligned with the edge of the wood. Brent dropped his heavy hand from my shoulder and gestured casually toward the empty chair across from Wade. He poured himself a glass of sparkling water from a crystal pitcher. Desperately trying to project a relaxed, unbothered aura, he told me they just needed to take care of a minor administrative headache before the real holiday festivities could officially begin. WDE slid the folder smoothly across the polished wood until it rested directly in front of me. He spoke in a low, soothing baritone voice, claiming this was nothing more than a routine compliance measure meant to close out the old fiscal year cleanly and efficiently. He called it a simple waiver regarding the Cedar Hollow property, a barren stretch of undeveloped land our father had left behind in the family trust. I sat down slowly and opened the folder. The paper was incredibly thick, the black ink crisp and formal. To an untrained observer, the dense blocks of legal jargon would look like standard, harmless corporate boilerplate meant to be signed without a second thought. But my eyes were far from untrained. I spent over 40 hours every single week dissecting exactly this kind of predatory legalese for Greyhaven. I scanned the first few pages, absorbing the structure of the agreement. Wade kept talking, his voice a steady drone of empty holiday platitudes and legal reassurances, attempting to distract me from actually comprehending the text. I tuned his voice out completely. I zeroed in on the indemnity clauses buried deep within the middle sections of the document. This was not a routine confirmation of land ownership. It was a complete unconditional surrender of my rights as a primary beneficiary. The document was maliciously designed to legally detach the Cedar Hollow land from the protected family trust and transfer it directly into the active collateral pool for Johnson Vale Development. Cedar Hollow was the absolute last piece of clean, debt-free earth our family name still held. Brent was actively trying to mortgage our final secure asset to breathe a few more weeks of artificial life into his collapsing residential tower project. But the second betrayal hidden within the pages was significantly worse. Tucked away in a dense, deliberately convoluted paragraph near the back was a massive liability transfer. If I signed my name on the bottom line, I would be legally authorizing the total release of my brother from all personal financial guarantees regarding his unpaid construction crews. Any future lawsuits, liens, or bankruptcy claims from the furious plumbers, electricians, and steel workers would be redirected entirely away from his personal bank accounts and dumped squarely onto the family trust. He was using our dead father's legacy as a bulletproof shield to protect his own luxury lifestyle. The heavy door clicked open and Elreen slipped into the room. She had perfectly timed her entrance for maximum emotional impact, acting as the closing mechanism of the trap. She stood directly behind Brent, placing the delicate hand over her heart, her face twisted into a florless mask of deep manufactured sorrow. She spoke in a trembling, fragile whisper, telling me how incredibly hard my brother worked every day and how much immense pressure he was under to carry the family legacy forward in a difficult economy. She deliberately framed the required signature not as a binding legal contract, but as a fundamental test of my loyalty. She told me that signing the paper was simply a beautiful way of supporting the family during the holy spirit of Christmas. She called it a chance to heal old misunderstandings and move forward together in love. I kept my eyes glued to the paper, letting the heavy silence stretch out in the small room. The longer I sat there without reaching for the silver pen Wade had offered, the more the atmosphere in the room visibly degraded. The confident, booming executive persona Brent had worn so proudly all evening began to crack and peel away. He leaned over the table, his face flushing a dark red, the veins in his neck standing out. His voice dropped the casual, brotherly pretense and adopted a harsh, vibrating edge of pure pleading. He told me the banking executives were being completely unreasonable about his credit lines, that the housing market was just going through a temporary 3-month dip, and that he desperately needed this one minor bridge loan to secure the financial future for all of us. For the very first time in my entire life, I heard raw, unfiltered panic echoing in my brother's voice. He was no longer commanding me. He was begging me. I knew I could not flatly refuse him right then and there. A hard, definitive rejection would send him into a defensive, unpredictable frenzy. He might try to forge my signature, or Wade might find a different, more destructive legal loophole before the night was over. I needed them to remain docile. I needed them to firmly believe they still had plenty of time to execute their plan. I slowly looked up from the document, adopting a slightly overwhelmed, profoundly confused expression. I pushed the folder back across the table, moving it just an inch away from my chest. I told them the legal language was simply too dense and complicated for me to understand. After a long, exhausting drive, I said I needed to take the paperwork back to my apartment and read it over a quiet cup of coffee the next morning, promising faithfully to drop it off at WD's downtown office right after the holiday weekend concluded. Brent looked absolutely furious, his jaw clenching so tight I thought his teeth might crack, but Wade quickly placed a calming, restraining hand on his forearm. Wade shot Brent a sharp, warning look that clearly communicated they should not spook a nervous target right before the trap finally closed. WDE smiled his oily, reassuring smile at me and agreed smoothly, saying there was absolutely no rush so long as the paperwork was signed and delivered by the end of the current week. They were completely, arrogantly convinced that my hesitation was born of simple intellectual inadequacy rather than strategic, calculated awareness. I stood up slowly, picking up the folder and holding it tightly against my chest, and walked out of the parlor. I did not return to the loud, crowded ballroom. Instead, I walked straight down the plush hallway and slipped unnoticed into the luxurious ladies' lounge. I locked the heavy oak door firmly behind me, ensuring I was completely alone. I laid the document flat on the pristine marble counter next to the gold-plated sinks. My hands were perfectly steady, devoid of any adrenaline shakes. I pulled out my phone and took perfectly clear, high-resolution photographs of every single page, focusing carefully on the liability transfer clauses and the collateral assignment paragraphs. I attached the dozen images to an encrypted email server and sent them directly to Mara Keene and the senior restructuring team waiting at Greyhaven. I turned on the faucet and washed my hands, the freezing cold water chilling my skin and sharpening my focus. I looked up at my reflection in the massive, brightly lit mirror. My dark wool coat was still visibly worn. My boots were still scuffed from the salt on the roads. Less than an hour ago, these very same people had publicly humiliated me in the grand lobby, parading my supposed poverty in front of their wealthy peers just to make themselves feel incredibly powerful. But as I grabbed a thick towel and dried my hands, the absolute, undeniable truth of the situation settled over me like a heavy, warm blanket. The arrogant men and women who had openly mocked my cheap clothes, were currently standing blindly on the crumbling edge of a massive financial cliff, and the quiet sister they had spent years dismissing as a worthless failure was the only life preserver they had left in the world. The bathroom was silent, a stark contrast to the roaring party outside. The cold marble under my hands grounded me. I closed my eyes and let the past rush in, feeling the familiar, heavy ache of history pressing against my chest. Our father had built his development firm from the ground up. I remembered him sitting at our heavy oak dining table late into the night, tracing over massive architectural blueprints with a blunt pencil. He often told me that my brother had the loud, magnetic charisma required to sell a grand vision to an empty room, but that I possessed the quiet, unyielding discipline needed to ensure the foundation never cracked under pressure. My father had explicitly intended to officially restructure the executive hierarchy of the firm. He wanted to grant me equal operational authority, ensuring no major financial risk could ever be executed without my direct calculated approval. But a massive heart attack took him suddenly at the age of 62. His protective plans died with him, remaining nothing more than unrecorded conversations and empty promises. Following the funeral, my brother moved with breathtaking speed to fill the power vacuum. Within a matter of weeks, he completely sidelined me. He weaponized his grief, convincing the remaining board members that he needed absolute control to steer the family legacy through a tragic transition. I was rapidly downgraded from a strategic partner to someone who was merely good at handling the background noise. I was given the tedious, invisible tasks. I processed the massive payrolls, filed the endless municipal zoning permits, and organized the chaotic trails of paperwork he carelessly behind. He ensured I was always buried in the administrative trenches, deliberately keeping me miles away from any position of real decision-making power. The absolute breaking point arrived 2 years later, during the construction of the riverfront commercial park. It was our largest undertaking to date. While conducting a routine late-night audit of the supply ledgers, I discovered a massive, dangerous discrepancy. The procurement management team had quietly substituted the high-grade, load-bearing steel specified in the engineering plans for significantly cheaper non-compliant alloy. The substitution was designed to cut structural costs by nearly 30% of legally padding the executive bonus pool. I gathered the invoices, printed the safety regulations, and took the undeniable evidence directly to my brother. I fully expected him to be outraged, to immediately fire the corrupt project managers, and to thank me for saving the firm from a catastrophic liability. Instead, he turned the weapon entirely on me. He convened an emergency meeting with the investors and spun a masterful, devastating lie. He claimed my obsessive, hysterical micromanagement of the supply chain had alienated our key vendors and caused a catastrophic 5-month delay. He took the blame for the cheap steel off the managers and pinned the operational failure squarely onto my shoulders. He painted my strict adherence to ethical building codes as a naive inability to handle the rough realities of the construction business. He publicly humiliated me and practically forced my immediate resignation to protect his own compromised deals. My mother and my sister-in-law eagerly embraced his fabricated narrative. They framed my departure as a tragic, embarrassing inability to handle high-level corporate pressure. When I eventually secured a new position at Greyhaven's Special Assets Group, they openly laughed at the career move. To my family, I had given up the prestige of real estate development to become a glorified debt collector wearing a cheap department store suit. They viewed my daily work as a depressing low-ras failure. They had absolutely no comprehension of what my new reality actually entailed. At Greyhaven, we did not waste our time making phone calls to harass people over unpaid credit cards. We performed complex corporate autopsies on failing commercial empires. We dismantled bankrupt organizations, liquidated toxic real estate portfolios, and restructured massive defaulted commercial loans. That job was a brutal, unforgiving forge. It trained me to strip away the glossy marketing brochures and see the absolute naked truth of a business. I learned how to read the silent panic hidden deep inside a restructured credit line. I learned how to spot the fatal arrogance buried inside a personal guarantee clause. Greyhaven taught me how to rid a man's impending ruin by simply tracing the desperate, erratic path of his unpaid invoices. 7 months ago, the regional commercial bank that held the primary construction loan for my brother's company unexpectedly collapsed under the weight of bad investments. The government regulators stepped in and the bank's entire portfolio of distressed assets was quickly auctioned off to the highest bidder. Greyhaven aggressively purchased the largest bundle of those failing loans. I was sitting quietly at my desk on a rainy Tuesday morning when the newly acquired digital files landed in our internal system. I opened the master ledger and stared at the bold black letters flashing across my screen. Johnson Vale Development. I did not hesitate. I immediately walked into my managing director's corner office and filed a comprehensive transparent conflict of interest disclosure. I laid out my exact blood relation to the chief executive officer and detailed my bitter history with the firm. I fully expected to be walled off from the account completely, assigned to a different portfolio for ethical reasons. But Greyhaven did not operate on sentiment. They operated on surgical efficiency. The executive board reviewed my disclosure and made a calculated decision to retain me as a confidential special advisor on the account. They recognized that absolutely no one else at the firm possessed my intimate granular knowledge of the foundational family assets, the complex historical contractor relationships, and the deeply buried original trust documents. For the past 6 months, I had been quietly, methodically tearing my brother's empire apart from the inside out. Late into the night, long after the rest of the office had gone dark, I sifted through thousands of pages of financial disclosures, tax returns, and vendor contracts. The deeper I dug into the files for his New Meridian Spire Residences project, the more horrifying the reality became. My brother was not simply experiencing a temporary cash flow problem due to a sluggish housing market, as he constantly claimed. He was running an incredibly reckless, desperate shell game. He was illegally pulling reserved funds from older, incomplete projects to aggressively pay off the most threatening lenders on his new tower. He was systematically hiding critical structural engineering flaws from the city inspectors just to pass the preliminary assessments and secure the next tranche of funding. Worst of all, he was entirely abandoning the independent subcontractors, the hardworking plumbers, the specialized electricians, and the local masonry crews had not seen a single paycheck in nearly 4 months. He was building his shiny, arrogant masterpiece on a crumbling foundation of complete financial fraud and human exploitation. Staring at my reflection in the brightly lit mirror of the Bellwether House Ladies' Lounge, the separate, fragmented pieces of my life finally locked together into a single, undeniable weapon. My family truly thought I had driven my rattling 10-year-old sedan to this extravagant Christmas Eve dinner out of some pathetic, lingering desire for their validation. They believed I was desperate to prove I was worthy of a seat at their wealthy crystal-covered table. They thought I would blindly sign away our father's last clean asset just to buy a fleeting moment of their toxic affection. They were completely wrong. I did not come to this hotel to wear a designer dress or to engage in a petty argument about my career choices. I did not come to prove that my bank account could ever match the hollow numbers in theirs. I came here to end a brutal decade of being silenced, dismissed, and used as a convenient scapegoat for their endless failures. I came to deliver a truth so absolute, so thoroughly documented by cold financial facts and legal statutes that none of their cruel jokes, manipulative tears, or loud lies could ever bend it again. The quiet, compliant sister they had thrown away years ago was gone forever. The woman standing in this hotel was the architect of their impending ruin, and I was finally ready to tear the building down. I slipped out of the ladies' lounge and bypassed the busy main corridor, taking a narrow, carpeted hallway reserved for hotel administration. It led directly to the executive business lounge on the mezzanine level. The space was dead quiet, dimly lit by brass reading lamps and smelling of rich espresso. Sitting at a secluded corner table overlooking the dark winter street below was Mara Keene. She wore a sharp, unyielding black suit, her laptop glowing brightly against the polished wood. She did not look up as I approached, merely sliding a thick leather-bound folio across the table toward my empty chair. Greyhaven is fully prepared to execute the asset seizure protocols, Mara said, her voice a low, perfectly modulated hum. The senior partners reviewed the photographic evidence you transmitted from the parlor. It confirms our worst projections. Your brother is actively attempting to cross-collateralize protected trust properties to cover fraudulent operational shortfalls. If he continues to deceive the primary creditors for another 48 hours, we will initiate a hostile foreclosure on the entire Meridian Spire project. I sat down and opened the folio. The stark reality of the numbers stared back at me. Johnson, Vale Development, was not a functioning company anymore. It was a rotting carcass being dragged forward by pure blind arrogance. Brent was parading around the grand ballroom downstairs as if he had just conquered the city, pouring thousand champagne for his investors. Yet, the forensic accounting proved his firm was completely insolvent. He was surviving entirely on a frantic day-to-day delay tactic, bouncing checks between regional banks to create the temporary illusion of liquidity. I pointed to a specific highlighted line item on the third page of the report, the $75,000 deposit for tonight. Adrian Vale confirmed the wire transfer was rejected, but look at the routing origin. Where did Brent actually try to pull that cash from? Mara leaned forward, her expression tightening into a mask of professional disgust. He tried to authorize a withdrawal from a restricted escrow account. That specific fund is legally designated as contractor retention pay for the Oakage Commercial Complex, a project you finalized 2 years ago. He is stealing the final payouts from his own plumbers and electricians to fund a luxury holiday garler. A cold, heavy knot formed in my stomach. It was one thing to outsmart greedy corporate banks, but stealing directly from the working class to fuel a fragile ego was an entirely different level of moral decay. I closed the folio and nodded at Mara, silently confirming our next move. I left the business lounge and walked toward the grand staircase. Before I could reach the top step, a figure stepped out from the shadows near the service elevator banks. He was a tall, solidly built man wearing a heavy canvas jacket. His boots were stained with dried white paint, and his hands were rough and calloused. He looked entirely out of place among the velvet curtains and crystal fixtures. It was Ivey Mercer, the owner of a small independent interior painting firm I had hired frequently during my tenure at the family company. MS. Johnson, Ivey said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion and suppressed panic. He glanced nervously over his shoulder, clearly worried hotel security would throw him out into the freezing night. I am sorry to ambush you like this. I heard from one of the caterers that you were attending this dinner. I had to find you. It is all right, Ivey, I replied, keeping my tone steady and calm. Why are you here? Ivey swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw tight. Your brother owes my crew for the last 3 months of labor on the Meridian Spire. I have 15 men working under me, good men with families. We finished the interior drywall and primer phases exactly on schedule, just like the contract demanded. But every time I submit the final invoice, his accounting office tells me the check is stuck in processing. Now they are ignoring my calls entirely. Tomorrow is Christmas. 2 of my best guys are facing eviction notices by the end of January if they do not pay their rent. I am pulling from my own savings just to buy their kids winter coats. We are drowning. MS. Johnson and your brother is downstairs, renting out the entire Bellwether house. I looked into Ivey's desperate, exhausted eyes. I did not offer him empty apologies or corporate excuses. My mind immediately cross-referenced his claims with the Grey Haven master ledger I had memorized. He was telling the absolute truth. Brent had deliberately frozen the payout accounts for the secondary subcontractors over 90 days ago. He had taken the money owed to the painters, the roofers, and the drywall installers and diverted it to cover the interest payments on his massive personal credit lines. The true horrifying purpose of the Cedar Hollow waiver suddenly snapped into crystal clear focus. The waiver Brent was begging me to sign was not just a legal shield. If I surrendered that piece of land, Wade Perrin would instantly mortgage it to a high-risk private lender for $2 million. But Brent would never use that cash to pay Ivey Mercer or the plumbers. He would use it to pacify the loudest, most dangerous corporate investors. He would use it to buy himself another 6 months of pretending to be a visionary billionaire, while the small, independent businesses he crushed along the way went completely bankrupt. I had spent the last few hours debating whether I could somehow engineer a soft landing for Johnson Vale Development. I had considered ways to restructure the debt to remove Brent from power, but keep the core company alive for the sake of my late father's memory. But listening to Illy, that lingering sense of family loyalty evaporated entirely. It was replaced by a sharp, icy clarity. I was no longer interested in saving the company. I was only interested in saving the innocent people trapped beneath its collapsing weight. "Go home to your family, Illy," I said softly, looking him directly in the eye. "Do not worry about the eviction notices. You will have your money, all of it." Illy searched my face, looking for a reason to believe me. He must have found it in my unwavering gaze, because his shoulders dropped slightly, a fraction of the heavy burden lifting. He thanked me in a hoarse whisper and slipped quietly back into the service elevator. As I descended the marble staircase and re-entered the bright, noisy lobby, Adrian Vale smoothly intercepted me near a towering floral arrangement. He did not break his stride, pretending to inspect a dropped napkin on the floor as he spoke softly into the air between us. "Your brother is becoming a severe liability to my staff," Adrian murmured, his tone clipped and furious. "In the last hour he has burnt a senior housekeeper to the point of tears because the ice in his suite was not perfectly clear. He demanded 5 complimentary premium rooms for his college friends, claiming his event contract included unlimited upgrades. It does not. He has also charged over $4,000 in premium scotch to a dummy room number, assuming we would just roll it into the final corporate invoice he cannot pay." Adrian stood up, his face a perfect mask of polite hotel management, but his dark eyes burned with silent outrage. Brent was treating the hotel staff like his personal servants, completely unaware that the very people he was insulting were currently holding the keys to his destruction. "Make sure the legal department is ready," I whispered back to Adrian without turning my head. "Lock the doors. Nobody leaves the ballroom until the announcement is made." I walked alone down the opulent hallway toward the grand doors of the dining hall. The music swelled louder with every step I took. The laughter of the wealthy investors echoed off the gold-painted walls. My brother, my mother, and my sister-in-law were waiting for me inside, fully believing they were the untouchable royalty of the city. They thought I was returning to the table to quietly sign away my rights, to sacrifice my future so they could continue their luxurious charade. But I had just made the final irrevocable moral decision of the night. I would not protect the family name. I would not shield a corrupt man simply because we shared the same blood. If keeping the Johnson name pristine meant actively stepping on the necks of men like Illy Mercer and the hard-working staff of the Bellwether House, then the name deserved to be completely destroyed. I pushed the heavy wooden doors open and stepped into the blinding light of the ballroom, ready to burn my brother's false empire to the ground. Before the heavy oak doors of the ballroom could swing fully shut behind me, my phone vibrated in the deep pocket of my wool coat. It was a single urgent code phrase from Mara Keene. I stopped dead in my tracks. The blinding lights and roaring laughter of the party were just steps away, but the message required immediate deviation. I stepped backward, letting the doors close, and slipped unnoticed into a soundproof bridal preparation suite located just off the main foyer. The room was bathed in a cool clinical light. Mara was standing beside a long vanity mirror, waiting for me. She did not have her laptop open. Instead, she held a thick yellowed envelope sealed with dark red wax. The air in the room felt incredibly heavy, charged with a strange electric tension. Mara stepped forward and explained that the document in her hands was a dormant, highly classified addendum pulled directly from my late father's original estate files. Grey Haven had secured it during the asset acquisition, but it came with strict legally binding activation triggers. The senior partners were completely forbidden from opening it until 2 very specific conditions were met in the real world. First, Johnson Vale Development had to be an active undocumented default on secondary contractor peril for over 90 days. Second, the current executive board had to make a documented legal attempt to force me into signing a liability waiver regarding the Cedar Hollow property. Both of those exact scenarios had materialized tonight. The trap my father built years ago had finally sprung. Mara broke the brittle red wax and slid the heavy parchment across the marble vanity. The handwriting belonged to my father. It was sharp, precise, and entirely devoid of the sentimental fluff my mother always preferred. I read the paragraph slowly, feeling the breath catch in my throat. My father explicitly detailed his profound awareness of Brent and his reckless, egotistical approach to business. He knew long before his death that my brother possessed the dangerous capability to build massive towers on foundations of sand. Because of this, my father had deliberately cordoned off the Cedar Hollow acreage. He mandated that this final pristine asset must never be leveraged to fund vanity projects, cover executive bonus pools, or mask operational failures. It was a fail-safe, a final parachute designed solely to make independent laborers whole or to fund a completely transparent corporate restructuring if the company ever faced legitimate bankruptcy. Then I read the clause that Wade Penn had spent 4 long years desperately trying to bury the legal authority to leverage, sell, or transfer the Cedar Hollow land did not belong to the board of directors. It did not belong to my mother, and it absolutely did not belong to Brent. The sole unilateral power of execution rested entirely and exclusively with me. My father had designated me as the secret primary co-executive of that specific trust branch. The sheer scale of Wade parents' professional deception washed over me. For years, Wade had intentionally blurred the lines of the estate in his annual briefings to the family. He used mountains of dense legal jargon to keep my mother and brother completely in the dark about who actually held the final key. He was terrified of my analytical background, so his strategy was to maintain a low level of pressure, hoping that one day I would grow exhausted by the family dynamics and simply sign a blind waiver to make them leave me alone. He wanted me to legally transfer my absolute authority back to Brent before I ever realized the power I held in my own hands. Mara reached into her leather briefcase and pulled out a slim digital tablet. She placed it on the vanity and pressed the screen. It was a secure video file my father had recorded in his private study just a few months before his fatal heart attack. Seeing his face again, hearing the rough, tired cadence of his voice hit me with the devastating force of a physical blow. The room around me seemed to fade away. He looked directly into the camera lens, his eyes heavy with regret, and he apologized. He confessed his cowardice in allowing the toxic family dynamic to continually crush my potential. He stated clearly, with no room for misinterpretation, that I possessed the true architectural mind of the family. He praised my quiet discipline, my risk management, and the unyielding moral backbone that my brother entirely lacked. He admitted he had catered to Brent out of a misplaced sense of traditional pride, but he knew I was the only one capable of surviving a true crisis. Then his tone hardened into a strict commanding directive. He warned me not to let familial guilt or soft-hearted compassion become a license for irresponsibility. He told me that if the day ever came when the company was drowning in its own arrogance, I must not throw my life away trying to save a sinking ship. I had to use the power he left me to do the right thing. No matter how much the family screamed or manipulated, a profound, shattering catharsis ripped through my chest. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or grief. It was the overwhelming weight of belated validation. For a decade, my mother, my brother, and my sister-in-law had systematically gaslit me into believing I was a small, incompetent woman meant only for the shadows. They had mocked my clothes, belittled my career, and treated me like a broken accessory. Now, my father's voice reached out from the grave to shatter their cruel illusion entirely. I was not the weak link in the bloodline. I was the anchor he had hidden away for the exact storm that was raging tonight. A dark, thrilling surge of vindictiveness flared in my veins. A part of me wanted to march out into that ballroom, grab a microphone, and scream the truth into the faces of the wealthy elite. I wanted to humiliate Brent purely for the visceral pleasure of watching his arrogant smile bleed away. But the cold, analytical logic that Greyhaven had drilled into me rapidly cooled my blood. True power was not an instrument for petty, chaotic cruelty. If I simply sought a dramatic, messy vengeance just to satisfy my own bruised ego, I would be no better than the man I was trying to stop. My father would not be proud of a screaming match. The destruction of Johnson Vale development had to be surgical, absolute, and undeniably just. It had to be about restoring the stolen livelihoods of desperate men like Illy Mercer, not just winning a family argument. Mara and I stood in the quiet room and finalized the exact sequence of execution. We agreed not to interrupt the dinner service. We would let Brent climb the absolute highest peak of his fabricated triumph. We would let him stand before the city politicians, the elite investors, and the captive audience and claim total untouchable victory. Only when he had fully sealed his own fate in front of 300 witnesses, only when there was absolutely no room left for Wade Perrin to spin a legal lie, would we allow the whole scheme to collapse beneath him. Just as Mara packed the heavy parchment and the digital tablet back into her briefcase, the screen of my phone illuminated the dim suite. The sudden burst of light caught my eye. It was a text message from my brother. I opened the message and read the words. They dripped with a toxic, patronizing arrogance that made my stomach turn. He demanded that I hurry back to the main ballroom immediately. He wrote that the first course was clearing out. He was preparing to give his grand holiday toast to the investors, and he wanted to invite his little sister up to the stage to say a few words for the family. He was not asking me to share the spotlight. He wanted to parade his conquered, impoverished victim in front of his wealthy peers, cementing his role as the benevolent patriarch who tolerated his failures. I did not reply to his message. I locked the phone screen and dropped it into my worn leather handbag. I looked at my reflection in the vanity mirror one last time. I smoothed the frayed lapels of my dark coat and nodded silently to Mara. I was finally ready to give my brother exactly what he asked for. I pushed open the heavy double doors of the grand ballroom and stepped into a space that looked as though it had been ripped directly from the glossy pages of a luxury lifestyle magazine. The sheer scale of the room was meant to intimidate and awe. A towering evergreen tree scraped the vaulted ceiling, dripping with thousands of white fairy lights and massive silver ornaments. A live jazz sextet played a smooth, upbeat holiday melody from a raised platform in the corner. Every round table was draped in heavy white linen and anchored by towering centerpieces of white roses and crystal candelabers. The ambient lighting was cast in a rich honeyed glow, specifically designed to flatter the dozens of wealthy faces currently milling about the room waiting eagerly to be impressed by my brother. Brant was completely in his element, holding court near the center of the room like a reigning monarch. He had shed his suit jacket, rolling his crisp white sleeves up to his forearms to project an image of a hardworking, down-to-earth visionary. I watched him slap the back of a prominent real estate broker and shake hands with a local city councilman. He was laughing loudly, telling exaggerated stories about his latest zoning victories, projecting an aura of absolute invincibility. As I navigated through the crowd, trying to blend into the background, Brent spotted me. He did not let me find a quiet corner. Instead, he reached out and firmly grabbed my elbow, pulling me directly into his circle of elite investors. The men in the group fell silent, turning their assessing gazes toward my faded wool coat. "And here she is, the final piece of the family puzzle," Brent announced, his voice booming over the smooth jazz. He offered the group a wide, entirely artificial smile. "This is my little sister. She works entirely in the grim, difficult world of foreclosure paperwork, dealing with all the messy, failing accounts down in the city, but she still managed to make an appearance tonight just to round out the family headcount." A few of the investors chuckled awkwardly, unsure how to react to the thinly veiled insult. Tessa materialized almost instantly, sliding her arm through his. She held a fresh glass of champagne and looked me up and down with exaggerated performative concern. "We are just so glad you finally made it inside, sweetie," Tessa said, her voice pitched loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear perfectly. I was starting to worry. "Did you manage to find a dress under that heavy coat that actually meets the hotel dress code? Or are you still wearing those bargain bin clearance items you love so much? You know, the Bellwether has a very strict policy, and I would absolutely hate for security to mistake you for a lost pedestrian." The silence in our immediate circle grew heavier. The investors exchanged uncomfortable glances, caught in the middle of a brutal family dynamic. Before I could even formulate a blank, neutral response, My mother stepped into the fray to deliver the killing blow. Lorraine placed a delicate hand on the chest of the nearest investor, sighing with the profound, practiced weariness of a long-suffering matriarch. "You must excuse her," Lorraine murmured softly, painting herself as the ultimate beacon of tolerance. "She has always been incredibly stubborn. It is just a terrible defense mechanism. She is terribly self-conscious because professional success has eluded her for so long. It is very difficult for her to be surrounded by true ambition. But we love her despite her obvious shortcomings. We just want her to feel included." I stood frozen in the center of their orchestrated humiliation. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or defend my wardrobe. I simply let their cruel words hang in the warm, honeyed air. I looked at the faces of the men surrounding us. I could see the subtle shift in their expressions. They were buying the narrative completely. To them, I was exactly what Brent painted me to be, a bitter, resentful sibling determined to cast a dark cloud over a joyous holiday celebration. Brent sensed the crowd was entirely on his side, and he capitalized on the momentum. He picked up a crystal knife and tapped it sharply against the side of his champagne flute. The sharp, ringing sound cut through the jazz music and the low chatter. The entire ballroom gradually fell silent, turning their attention toward my brother. "Family, friends, and esteemed partners," Brent began, projecting his voice flawlessly across the massive room. He raised his glass high. "Tonight is about celebrating monumental success, but it is also about family. The journey of Johnson Vale development has not been easy. As the older brother, I had to take the heavy mantle of our father's legacy and drag it into the modern era. I had to carry the immense burden of leadership. My sister chose a different path. She chose to live a very small, quiet life away from the risks and the triumphs of real estate. And while we may not always see eye to eye, Christmas is a time for forgiveness." He paused, letting the dramatic weight of his words settle over the room. He looked directly at me, his eyes shining with a toxic, triumphant gleam. "So tonight, I ask all of us to simply open our hearts," Brent continued smoothly. "Let us leave our old jealousies behind. Let us celebrate the massive, undeniable future of the Meridian Spire project together." The room erupted into polite, sustained applause. People raised their glasses, smiling warmly at Brent, completely captivated by his magnanimous performance. He was the hero of his own fabricated movie, the gracious king pardoning his pathetic, difficult sister. I did not clap. I simply let my eyes drift away from his beaming face and scan the perimeter of the room near the heavy velvet drapes that framed the main stage. I spotted Adrian Vale. The general manager was standing perfectly motionless in the shadows. He caught my eye and gave a single definitive nod. I then looked toward the elevated audio booth. At the back of the hall, the sound engineer, a young man wearing a black hotel uniform, was casually resting his hand over the master control board. He was not looking at Brent. He was looking at Adrian, waiting for a signal. The microphone line at the podium had already been electronically locked and isolated, exactly as we had planned. The applause died down, and the guests began to move toward their assigned tables for the first course. Brent did not move to his seat. Instead, he walked directly toward me, his chest puffed out with arrogant victory. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out the thick, legally binding folder he had tried to force on me in the private parlor. He stopped inches from my face, invading my personal space. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the sharp smell of liquor on his breath. He held the folder out, pressing it firmly against my chest. "I am done waiting, and I am done playing nice," Brent hissed, his voice dropping to a vicious, threatening whisper meant only for my ears, even as he kept a wide fake smile plastered on his face for the lingering guests. "I want you to sign this waiver right now, right here in the middle of this party. Take a pen out of your cheap little bag and put your name on the paper. Prove to me and to everyone else in this room that you are not just a pathetic, jealous failure whose only goal in life is to stand in my way." He shoved the folder harder against my coat, stepping back to cross his arms. He was utterly convinced he had backed me into an inescapable corner. He believed the sheer weight of public pressure, combined with his flawless, dominating performance, would finally break my spirit and force me to surrender our father's last remaining asset. He stood there waiting for me to crumble, completely oblivious to the fact that he was standing on a trap door, and I was holding the lever. I looked down at the heavy legal folder pressed firmly against my chest. I did not raise my hands to take it. I simply kept my arms rigidly at my sides and took one slow, deliberate step backward, deprived of my physical support. The thick manila envelope slipped from his grasp. It fell through the warm air and hit the polished hardwood floor of the ballroom with a heavy definitive slap. The sound was not deafening, but in the immediate hushed circle around us, it was more than enough to draw the curious stares of two prominent real estate brokers. Brent froze completely. The flawless, magnanimous smile he had worn all evening violently shattered, replaced instantly by a flash of naked, unrestrained rage. For the very first time tonight, his carefully constructed public persona cracked wide open. He lunged forward, his heavy fingers digging into the fabric of my upper arm with bruising, desperate force. He did not care who was watching him anymore. He dragged me roughly away from the glittering crystal tables, pulling me forcefully through a swinging wooden door that led directly into a dimly lit service corridor. The festive music and the roar of wealthy laughter were instantly muffled, replaced by the harsh, vibrating hum of industrial refrigerators and the sharp scent of chemical floor cleaners. The contrast was incredibly jarring, pulling us violently out of his expensive fantasy and throwing us into the cold, hidden reality of the working hotel. Brent slammed his open hand against the painted cinder block wall, deliberately blocking my path back to the ballroom. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Brent spat, the veins in his neck bulging aggressively against his stiff white collar. The fake brotherly affection was completely gone, replaced by the vicious, ugly desperation of a cornered animal. "You are going to pick that folder up and you are going to sign it right now. If you do not put your name on that waiver tonight, the entire company goes under by the first week of January. Decades of our work, millions of dollars completely wiped out. And when these investors lose everything, I will make absolutely certain they know it was your petty, pathetic jealousy that destroyed the Johnson family legacy." Before I could even process the sheer audacity of his threat, the heavy swinging door opened again. My mother slipped quickly into the narrow hallway, her expensive silk shawl sliding off her shoulders in her haste. She had eagerly followed us, sensing the sudden collapse of their master plan. She immediately resorted to her oldest, most toxic weapon. "Kylie, please," Lorraine pleaded, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured grief. "Do not do this to us. Think of your father. He built this incredible empire with his bare hands. He would be absolutely sickened to see you standing here holding your own brother hostage out of some childish spite. It is Christmas Eve. We are supposed to be a loyal family protecting our own name. If you walk away from us tonight, you are spitting on the grave of the man who gave you absolutely everything. For many long years, that exact speech would have paralyzed me entirely. I would have folded inward, suffocated by the heavy artificial guilt they constantly draped over my shoulders. I would have believed that their financial survival was somehow my moral responsibility. But tonight, their desperate words held absolutely no power over me. I looked at the two of them, standing in the cold shadows of the service, and felt nothing but profound analytical pity. "Do not ever dare invoke his name to cover your corporate crimes," I said, my voice dropping to a low, razor-sharp whisper that echoed clearly off the concrete walls. I did not yell. I did not scream or lose my temper. I spoke with the terrifying, unyielding calm of a judge delivering a final absolute sentence. "You are not trying to save the family legacy. You are trying to save your own fragile, massive ego. You want me to sign away the very last clean piece of land our father owned so you can blindly mortgage it to a high-risk private lender and pretend you are still wealthy." Brent blinked rapidly, his face suddenly draining of all color. He opened his mouth to deny it, but I did not give him a single second to breathe or formulate a lie. "You have not paid the independent electrical contractors in 4 entire months," I continued, taking a bold step forward, forcing him to press his back flat against the cold wall. "You owe the plumbers and the interior painters hundreds of thousands of dollars. You took the exact money you owed to hardworking men, men who are facing eviction in the dead of winter, and you used it to float the interest rates on your own personal luxury credit lines. And worst of all, you brought our family to the most expensive venue in the city to put on a fake parade of absolute wealth, fully knowing your bank account bounced the $75,000 deposit for that ballroom exactly 2 hours ago. The silence in the narrow corridor became absolute and suffocating. Lorraine let out a tiny stifled gasp, her manicured hand flying up to cover her mouth in genuine horror. Brent simply stared at me, his jaw slack, his eyes wide with a sudden paralyzing terror. He finally realized I knew the absolute truth, but his arrogant mind still could not comprehend the massive, fatal depth of my knowledge. He thought I had simply overheard a malicious rumor or seen a stray, unpaid invoice left on a desk. He had absolutely no idea I was holding the master ledger of his entire financial existence. "I am more than willing to save the innocent people you dragged down into the dirt," I told him, looking directly into his terrified, shifting eyes. "I will make sure the drywall installers keep their homes. I will make sure the hotel staff gets paid for dealing with your insufferable, demanding arrogance all evening, but I will never put my name on a piece of paper that legally shields you from the severe consequences of your own fraud. You are entirely on your own." I turned my back on them without another word, leaving my mother and brother standing frozen in the cold fluorescent light of the service hallway. I pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped back into the warm honeyed glow of the celebration. The jazz band was playing a soft melodic tune. The waiters were pouring the final glasses of expensive wine before the dinner service officially began. I walked with immense purpose, navigating the perimeter of the room until I reached the heavy velvet drapes near the main entrance. Adrian Vale stepped out of the shadows to meet me, his posture impeccable, his expression completely unreadable to the wealthy guests, laughing just a few feet away. I looked at the general manager and gave him the final irrevocable signal I had been holding on to all night. "Now," I said softly. Adrian nodded once, reaching into his tailored pocket to retrieve his secure communication radio. But before he could press the transmission button to end the event, I placed a gentle hand on his sleeve, adding one final critical directive to our plan. It was an instruction born from a deep desire for ethical justice, a calculated way to turn my brother's empty vanity into something truly meaningful. "When you reclaim this massive space, do not let the kitchen throw a single piece of food away," I instructed him, making sure my voice was perfectly clear over the background music. "The roast beef, the imported caviar, the elaborate desserts, all of it stays exactly where it is. I want you to immediately invite every single hotel employee working the holiday shift into this room to eat. Furthermore, I have a list of 20 independent contractors and their families who have been starving because of Johnson Vale development. They are waiting for a phone call right now. Tonight, this grand ballroom is no longer a monument to my brother's ego. It is a relief dinner for the exact people he tried to destroy." Adrian stared at me for a fraction of a second. The strict professional detachment in his dark eyes melted away entirely, replaced by a profound, unmistakable glimmer of deep respect. He bowed his head slightly, acknowledging the immense moral weight of the command. He brought the radio to his lips and quietly authorized the legal department to initiate the total breach protocol. I turned my attention back toward the front of the grand room. Brent had finally emerged from the service corridor. His face was exceptionally pale and slick with nervous sweat, but he was desperately trying to maintain the grand illusion of control. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, forced a wide, strained smile onto his face, and began to march aggressively toward the raised stage. The investors clapped him respectfully on the back as he passed their tables, entirely unaware that the confident man they were cheering for was already a financial ghost. Brent reached the wooden podium and confidently grabbed the microphone stand. He looked out over the sea of crystal glasses and wealthy faces, taking a deep breath to deliver his grand triumphant holiday speech. He truly believed he still had a chance to manipulate the narrative, to charm the entire room, and somehow force his way out of the impending disaster. He opened his mouth to speak, leaning eagerly into the microphone, entirely oblivious to the fact that the audio feed was completely dead, and the true master of the house was already walking up the carpeted steps right behind him. Brent tapped the silver grill of the microphone. A dull, hollow thud echoed weakly against the front row of tables, completely devoid of the booming electronic amplification he expected. He cleared his throat, leaning closer, and spoke his welcoming remarks. His voice barely reached the third tier of seating. He tapped the stand again, harder this time, a flash of genuine irritation crossing his sweaty face. He looked toward the back of the room, waving an angry hand at the audio engineer, demanding immediate service. The engineer did not even blink. Instead, the heavy velvet curtains beside the stage parted, and Adrian Vale walked measuredly into the honeyed light. The general manager did not look like a man arriving to fix a technical glitch. He carried a leather-bound clipboard and moved with the undeniable authority of an executioner. He bypassed Brent entirely and stepped up to a secondary freestanding podium near the edge of the stage. He flipped a switch on the base of his own microphone. A sharp, clear hum instantly filled the massive space, silencing the low murmurs of the confused investors and halting the jazz band mid-note. Adrian looked out over the sea of wealthy faces, his expression perfectly composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, I sincerely apologize for the sudden interruption to your evening," Adrian announced, his voice echoing flawlessly off the high gold-painted ceilings. "Instead of introducing your first course, hotel administration must issue an immediate urgent notice regarding the legal standing of tonight's event." Brent froze. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him a sickly pale white. He stepped toward Adrian, his hands raised in a frantic attempt to stop the announcement, but two broad-shouldered men in dark suits stepped seamlessly out of the shadows. They were the internal hotel, legal counsel, and head of security. They placed themselves firmly between my brother and the general manager, creating an impenetrable wall. Effective exactly 5 minutes ago, the corporate account for Johnson Vale Development has been flagged for critical violation. Adrian continued, his tone devoid of any sympathy. The initial deposit required to secure this venue was officially returned due to insufficient funds, and the subsequent event costs have been deemed entirely unsecured. Therefore, Johnson Vale Development no longer holds the rights to this space. The entire ballroom plunged into a dead, horrifying silence. The clinking of crystal glasses stopped abruptly. 250 of the most powerful people in the city stared at the stage in absolute shock. I watched the prominent real estate brokers exchange stunned rapid glances. The wealthy politicians who had just been shaking Brent's hand suddenly leaned back in their chairs, physically distancing themselves from the epicenter of a massive financial scandal. Brent opened his mouth to shout a defense, to spin a frantic lie about banking errors, but his dead microphone rendered him entirely mute against the sheer magnitude of the room. However, Adrian said, raising his voice slightly to command the absolute attention of the crowd. Every single eye snapped back to him. The evening is not cancelled. The administrative rights, along with the full financial backing for the entirety of tonight's costs, have been legally transferred and secured by a new host. Adrian turned his head deliberately and looked directly at me. Following his gaze, the investors, the politicians, my sister-in-law, and my mother all turned in their seats. The collective weight of their stares crashed down on me, but this time I did not shrink. I stood perfectly straight near the grand entrance, my hands clasped loosely in front of me, my warm wool coat standing in stark contrast to their designer gowns and silk ties. At the direct request of MS. Kylie Johnson, Adrian announced, letting my name ring clearly through the silent air. This private corporate garler is officially dissolved. From this moment forward, the space will be utilized for the Bellwether Holiday Relief Dinner. We are currently opening the doors to our dedicated holiday service staff, as well as the families of the independent contractors who have suffered severe wage theft from the previous host. The food will not go to waste. It will go to the people who truly earned it. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Tesser dropped her crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the polished hardwood floor, a sharp, violent sound that broke the final spell of my brother's illusion. Right on cue, Mara Keene stepped out from the side corridor. She walked past the stunned investors with predatory grace, climbing the short steps to the stage. She did not use a microphone. She simply walked straight up to my brother and pressed a thick, heavy legal dossier directly into his trembling hands. Brent stared down at the documents, his eyes darting frantically over the bold letterhead. It was the absolute confirmation from Grey Haven's Special Assets Group, proving we currently owned the entirety of his defaulted debt. Slipped right behind that master ledger was the activated addendum from our father's estate, the exact document proving Wade Perrin's long con had failed and that the ultimate authority over the remaining family land belonged solely to me. I walked slowly down the center aisle of the ballroom. The wealthy guests parted from me instinctively, pulling their chairs back, completely silent. I stopped at the base of the stage, looking up at the man who had spent the last decade trying to convince the world I was nothing. "I am not going to sign the waiver to save your residential tower, Brent," I said. My voice was calm, but the acoustics of the silent room carried my words to every single table. "I am executing my right to liquidate the final trust property, but the capital will not touch your corporate accounts. Every single dollar is going into a heavily monitored escrow fund. It will be used exclusively to pay the drywall installers, the electricians, and the hotel staff you tried to cheat. And my final condition for releasing those funds to save you from federal fraud charges is your immediate unconditional resignation from the executive board." Brent looked like a building that had just suffered a catastrophic structural collapse. His shoulders caved inward. The arrogant, booming executive was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, terrified shell of a man realizing he had just lost absolutely everything in front of the very people he worked. He could not even formulate a sentence. He just stared at the papers in his hands, completely broken. Suddenly, Lorraine rushed forward from her front row table. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. She grabbed the railing of the stage, looking down at me with a mixture of raw panic and furious desperation. "Kylie, stop this right now." Lorraine sobbed loudly, trying to weaponize her distress for the audience. "You are destroying our family. You are completely tearing us apart in front of the whole city. How can you be so cruel to your own blood?" I looked at my mother. I felt a fleeting pang of sadness for the woman who cared more about a fake image than her own children, but I did not let it soften my resolve. I did not raise my voice, but I made sure my words cut through the air with absolute, uncompromising clarity. "I am not destroying this family, Mother," I replied firmly. "I am simply refusing to let you use me as a doormat for his arrogance anymore. You built a glass house on stolen money, and you are angry at me because you finally shattered it yourselves." Lorraine stepped back as if she had been physically struck. She looked around the room, desperately seeking sympathy from the wealthy friends she had bragged to just an hour ago. But the elite investors were already standing up, quietly retrieving their coats and moving toward the exits. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a sinking ship. They walked right past Brent without a second glance. As the wealthy elite filtered out, a different crowd began to cautiously enter the ballroom from the service corridors. I saw the exhausted hotel housekeepers, the valet drivers shivering in their winter coats, and the kitchen staff. Behind them walked Lee Mercer and a dozen other men in thick canvas jackets, leading their wives and widdy children into the warm, honeyed light of the grand space. Adrian Vale immediately directed his staff to seat the new arrivals at the pristine crystal tables. I stood near the towering Christmas tree, watching the room transform. Brand remained frozen on the stage, entirely ignored, a phantom haunting his own ruined party. He had wanted a stage to prove his superiority, and in the end, that was exactly what he got. I pulled my faded dark coat tighter around my shoulders and breathed in the scent of fresh pine and roasted cinnamon. I had not come here to wear a designer dress or prove I belonged in their hollow world. I came to use the power I had earned to rip down a lie and build something real in its place. And looking at the tired, hard-working families finally sitting down to a hot, extravagant meal, I knew my father would have been incredibly proud. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Please let me know in the comments exactly where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. I would greatly appreciate it if you could subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so that this story can reach and be heard by many more people. Thanks for watching.